The bitter December wind howled through the narrow streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and the distant clanging of ship bells from the harbor. Snow had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes that clung to the grimy windows of tenement buildings and gathered in dirty piles along the cobblestone streets. It was the kind of evening that drove honest folk indoors early, leaving the shadowy corners to those who preferred darkness for their business. Caleb Mercer sat in his second-floor apartment overlooking the docks, staring out at the forest of masts that swayed like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The two-story building had once been home to his dreams that died 2 years ago when consumption claimed his beloved Anna. Now it felt more like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of laughter that would never return and the echo of footsteps that would never again climb those creaking stairs. The Irishman's hands were wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee, the third he'd poured that evening, though he'd barely touched any of them. His red hair had grown wild and unkempt, and his green eyes had lost the spark that once made Anna tease him about looking like a leprechaun who'd lost his pot of gold. The fire in the small hearth cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines that grief had carved there like scars from an invisible blade. Once, Caleb Mercer had been a man of action. As a firefighter with Engine Company 21, he charged into burning buildings without hesitation, his powerful frame cutting through smoke and flame to carry the helpless to safety. His fellow firemen had called him Iron Cal for his seemingly indestructible constitution and his refusal to back down from any blaze, no matter how fierce. But that was before Anna's gentle hands had shown him there was more to life than battling flames, before her death had left him battling a different kind of fire, one that burned inside his chest and threatened to consume him from within. The apartment around him bore testament to his decline. Dirty dishes sat stacked in the small kitchen sink, and newspapers lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The bed in the corner remained unmade, its blankets twisted into knots from restless nights spent wrestling with memories and regrets. Even the photographs of Anna that had once brought him comfort now lay face down on the mantelpiece, too painful to look at yet too precious to put away. Outside, the city's evening symphony began to play, the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, the shouts of late vendors trying to sell their remaining wares, the distant sound of an accordion playing a melancholy Irish tune that seemed to drift up from the street like smoke. It was a song Anna had loved, one she would hum while cooking their simple meals or mending his torn uniforms. Now it only served to twist the knife of loneliness deeper into his heart. The knock came so softly that at first Caleb thought it might be the wind rattling the door. 3 gentle taps, hesitant and respectful. Nothing like the demanding pounds of bill collectors or the aggressive banging of the men who sometimes came looking for work or trouble. He remained motionless in his chair, hoping whoever it was would simply go away and leave him to his solitude. The knock came again, still soft but more insistent this time, followed by a voice that made him freeze. "Please, sir, I know you're in there. I can see the light under the door." It was a woman's voice, young and frightened, with an accent that spoke of education despite the tremor of fear that ran through it. There was something else, too, a quality that reminded him painfully of Anna, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Against his better judgment, Caleb found himself rising from his chair and walking slowly toward the door, his bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floors. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "My name is Evelyn," came the reply. I need to speak with you about your wife, about Anna." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow, and he staggered backward as if struck. No one had spoken Anna's name in his presence for months. Most people in the neighborhood had learned to avoid the subject entirely after witnessing his violent reactions to well-meaning condolences. His hands began to shake as he reached for the door handle, hesitating as 1,000 questions raced through his mind. "Anna's been dead for 2 years, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," the woman replied, and there was infinite sadness in those 2 simple words. "Please, sir, it's cold out here, and I have something that belongs to you." Something in her tone, perhaps the way she spoke with such certainty about things she couldn't possibly know, made Caleb's decision for him. He turned the heavy iron lock and pulled open the door, immediately feeling the bite of the winter wind as it rushed past him into the warm apartment. Standing on his threshold was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her dark hair covered by a traditional Jewish headscarf that had been pulled up to shield her face from the snow. But it wasn't her appearance that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. It was what she carried in her arms. Bundled in a thick woolen blanket, protected from the cold by layers of carefully arranged cloth, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, and even in the dim light from the hallway, Caleb could see the perfect curve of tiny fingers and the peaceful expression of a child lost in innocent sleep. "May I come in?" Evelyn asked, her teeth chattering slightly from the cold. "I promise I'll explain everything. But please." "She's been out in this weather too long already." Caleb stepped aside wordlessly, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. The woman entered his apartment with careful, measured steps, her eyes taking in the chaos of his living space without judgment. She moved to the chair nearest the fire and settled herself carefully, adjusting the blanket around the baby with practiced ease that spoke of genuine experience caring for children. "You said your name was Evelyn," Caleb managed, closing the door and turning to face his unexpected visitors. "How did you know Anna? How do you know where I live?" The young woman looked up at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow far beyond her years. "I was with her at the end," she said simply. "At the sanatorium upstate. We became friends during her last months there." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He had been forbidden from visiting Anna during her final stay at the tuberculosis hospital. The doctors had insisted that the risk of infection was too great, and that the emotional strain of visits often made patients worse rather than better. He had spent those last months knowing his wife was dying alone, surrounded by strangers, and the guilt of that abandonment had been eating at him ever since. "She talked about you constantly," Evelyn continued, her voice soft but clear. "About your life together, about the dreams you shared, about how much she loved watching you come home from the fire station with soot on your face and pride in your eyes. She said you made her feel safe in a world that had never been kind to people like us." "People like us?" Caleb echoed, sinking into his own chair across from her. "Immigrants, outsiders, people trying to build something good in a city that seems designed to tear down anyone who isn't born to privilege." Evelyn's accent became more pronounced as she spoke, revealing traces of both German and Russian influence beneath her carefully practiced English. "Anna told me about coming over from County Cork, about how you two found each other in this vast, lonely place and decided to make it home." Caleb felt tears burning behind his eyes, tears he had thought were long since exhausted. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Why are you telling me this?" Instead of answering immediately, Evelyn looked down at the baby in her arms and gently pulled back a corner of the blanket. The infant stirred slightly, making small sounds of contentment, and as her tiny face became visible in the firelight, Caleb felt the world tilt on its axis. The baby had Anna's eyes. Part 2. Stunned silence and confession. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Caleb Mercer could only stare. The resemblance was unmistakable. Those same deep blue eyes that had first captured his heart in a crowded dance hall 6 years ago. The same delicate curve of the eyebrows. Even the same way the tiny lips pursed slightly in sleep. It was as if Anna herself was looking up at him from beyond the grave, speaking to him through this impossible child who couldn't exist and yet lay breathing softly in a stranger's arms. "No," he whispered, the word escaping his lips like a prayer denied. "No, this isn't Anna, never." His voice trailed off as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were telling him. The room seemed to spin around him, and he gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Evelyn watched his reaction with infinite patience, her own expression a mixture of compassion and understanding. She had clearly anticipated this moment, had perhaps rehearsed it during the long journey that had brought her to his door. "Anna wanted to tell you herself," she said gently. "She tried to write you letters so many times, but the words never seemed right. How do you tell the man you love that you're carrying his child when you know you're dying?" The revelation hit Caleb like a sledgehammer to the chest. He doubled over, gasping for breath as the implications crashed over him in waves. Anna had been pregnant when she entered the sanatorium. She had carried their child through her final months of illness, knowing she would never live to see the baby grow up, never live to hold their daughter in the safety of their own home. The consumption, he managed to choke out, it would have made the pregnancy dangerous. The doctors would have said. The doctors said many things, Evelyn interrupted, her voice taking on a harder edge. They said she should terminate the pregnancy to preserve her strength for fighting the disease. They said carrying a child would hasten her death. They said the baby would likely be born sickly and weak, if it survived at all. She looked down at the healthy infant in her arms and smiled sadly. Anna told them all to go to hell. Caleb felt fresh tears streaming down his face as he imagined his brave, stubborn wife facing down a room full of medical professionals, choosing their unborn child over her own slim chances of recovery. It was exactly the kind of fierce, protective love that had drawn him to Anna in the first place. The same love that had made her tend to his wounds after dangerous fires, that had made her stand up to his drinking buddies when they got too rowdy, that had made her fight for every day they had together even as her body grew weaker and weaker. She named her Margaret, Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper. After your mother. She said you used to tell her stories about how your mother would sing Irish lullabies when you were frightened by storms, and she wanted the baby to have that same strength and gentleness. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. His mother, Margaret Mercer, had died when he was barely 12 years old, taken by the same kind of fever that claimed so many in the crowded tenements of his childhood. But her memory had remained a beacon of warmth and safety throughout his life, and he had shared those memories with Anna during their quiet evenings together, never imagining that she was storing them away for a future he hadn't known existed. How? He asked, his voice broken and raw. How did you end up with her? What happened to Anna? Evelyn's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. The birth was difficult, she said. Anna was so weak by then, so tired from fighting the disease, but she held on long enough to see Margaret's first breath, to hold her for just a few precious minutes. She made me promise. Her voice broke entirely, and she had to take several deep breaths before continuing. She made me promise that I would find you, that I would tell you about Margaret and ask if you would raise her as your own. She said she knew it wasn't fair to burden you with a child you never knew existed, especially when you were still grieving her loss. But she also said that you had so much love to give, and that Margaret deserved to know her father. Caleb rose from his chair on unsteady legs and moved closer to where Evelyn sat. The baby, his daughter, Margaret, stirred slightly at his approach, and one tiny hand escaped from the confines of her blanket. Without thinking, Caleb reached out and gently touched that perfect little hand, marveling at how soft and warm it felt against his calloused fingers. Part 3. Denial and Acceptance. The moment Caleb's finger made contact with his daughter's hand, something fundamental shifted inside his chest. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, her tiny fingers wrapping around his much larger one with an instinctive trust that nearly brought him to his knees. For the first time in 2 years, the crushing weight of grief that had been pressing down on his heart seemed to lighten, replaced by something he had thought was lost forever: hope. She's so small, he whispered, awe and terror warring in his voice. How have you been caring for her? Where have you been living? Evelyn shifted the baby carefully, preparing to place her in Caleb's arms. There's a boarding house on Hester Street that takes in women in difficult circumstances. The proprietress, Mrs. Goldstein, has been very kind. She has grandchildren of her own and helped me learn how to feed Margaret, how to change her clothes, how to know when she's sick or just fussy. She paused, looking up at Caleb with uncertainty. Would you like to hold her? Caleb's hands began to shake again, but this time it wasn't from grief or shock. It was from the overwhelming fear that he might somehow hurt this precious, fragile life that Anna had entrusted to him. I don't know how, he admitted. Anna and I always planned to have children someday, but we thought we had time. I thought we had so much time. Anna thought the same thing, Evelyn said softly. But she also said that love doesn't wait for perfect timing, and that you would learn because you had to, because Margaret needed you to. With infinite care, Evelyn transferred the sleeping baby into Caleb's arms, guiding his hands to support the tiny head and showing him how to cradle her body against his chest. The moment Margaret settled against him, Caleb felt something inside his heart that had been frozen solid for 2 years begin to thaw. The baby made a small sound of contentment and nestled closer to his warmth, as if she recognized some essential part of him even in her sleep. God in heaven, Caleb breathed, staring down at the miracle in his arms. She really does have Anna's eyes. And look at this hair. It's the same red as mine was when I was young. He touched the soft curl of auburn hair that peeked out from under Margaret's cap, marveling at how it caught the firelight exactly the way his own had in his youth. As if summoned by her father's voice, Margaret chose that moment to wake up. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing with the kind of intense concentration that only babies possess, and she looked directly up at Caleb's face. For a long moment, father and daughter regarded each other in perfect silence, two souls meeting for the first time, yet somehow recognizing each other on a level deeper than conscious thought. Then Margaret smiled, not the reflexive grimace that adults often mistake for baby smiles, but a genuine expression of joy and recognition that lit up her entire face. The sight of that smile, so reminiscent of Anna's own radiant happiness, finally broke through the last of Caleb's defenses. He began to weep openly, tears of grief and joy mingling on his cheeks as he held his daughter close. "Anna," he whispered to the empty air, as if his wife's spirit might be lingering nearby to witness this moment. "Anna, she's perfect. She's absolutely perfect." Evelyn watched this reunion with tears in her own eyes, remembering the countless nights she had spent caring for Margaret while wondering if this day would ever come. "Anna left something else for you," she said, reaching into the worn leather satchel she had brought with her. She spent her last weeks writing in a journal, recording everything she wanted Margaret to know about her parents, about their love story, about the dreams they shared. She pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with Anna's familiar handwriting. Even from across the room, Caleb could see his wife's distinctive script, the same elegant loops and curves that had once adorned love letters and shopping lists and little notes left on his pillow when she had to wake early for work. "She wrote about the day you first met," Evelyn continued, "about your wedding day, about all the little moments that made up your life together. She wanted Margaret to know that she was created from the deepest love, not from carelessness or accident. She wanted her to understand that both of her parents would have given anything to be able to raise her together." Caleb looked down at Margaret, who had settled back into peaceful sleep in his arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with perfect regularity. The sight of her, combined with the knowledge that Anna had spent her final days preparing this gift for both of them, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the day his wife died. "What do you need?" he asked Evelyn, his voice stronger now, more decisive. "Money? Place to stay? You've been caring for my daughter for months. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Evelyn shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Anna already repaid me more than you know. She became my friend when I had no one else in the world, and she taught me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love you when you need it most." She paused, looking around the apartment with its signs of neglect and abandonment. "But I do think Margaret needs her father to start living again, instead of just surviving." The words stung because they were true. Caleb looked around his apartment with fresh eyes, seeing it as Evelyn must see it, as a tomb where a broken man had been slowly dying for 2 years. This was no place to raise a child, no environment in which Margaret could thrive and grow into the strong, confident woman Anna would have wanted her to become. But even as these thoughts formed in his mind, Caleb heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs outside his door, accompanied by low voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Evelyn heard it too, and her face immediately went pale with fear. "They followed me," she whispered, clutching her satchel tighter. "I was so careful, but they must have followed me anyway." Part 4. The Street That Always Waits. The footsteps stopped directly outside Caleb's door, and in the sudden silence that followed, He could hear the soft creak of floorboards as someone shifted their weight. 3 men, by the sound of it, maybe 4. Professional men who knew how to move quietly but couldn't quite eliminate the small sounds that betrayed their presence to someone who knew how to listen. Caleb's firefighter training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify the threats, protect the innocent. "Who are they?" he whispered to Evelyn, carefully transferring Margaret back to her arms despite his reluctance to let his daughter go. "Barrett Crowley," Evelyn replied, her voice barely audible. He's Anna's brother." The revelation hit Caleb like a slap to the face. In all their years together, Anna had never mentioned having any family in America. She had spoken occasionally of distant relatives back in Ireland, cousins and aunts she had lost touch with over the years, but never a brother. Never anyone close enough to have a claim on her child. "Anna never told me she had a brother," Caleb said, his voice hardening with suspicion. "She had her reasons," Evelyn replied, fear making her words come in quick, short bursts. "Barrett he isn't a good man, Caleb. He runs numbers and protection rackets throughout the Lower East Side. Anna cut ties with him years ago when she married you, but he's always kept track of her. When word got out that she had died leaving behind a child, the implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a smoldering fire. Barrett Crowley wasn't here out of familial love or concern for his sister's orphan child. He was here because Margaret represented something valuable, leverage, perhaps, or access to some kind of inheritance or property that Caleb didn't even know existed. A knock came at the door, 3 measured raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and threatening at the same time. "Mr. Mercer?" called a voice from the other side, smooth and cultured but with an undertone of steel that suggested its owner was accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Caleb moved quickly to the small closet where he kept his old fire department equipment, retrieving the double-barrel shotgun he had purchased shortly after Anna's death but never had occasion to use. The familiar weight of the weapon in his hands brought back memories of his younger days in Ireland, when political tensions had required every man to know how to defend his family and his beliefs. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caleb called back, checking to make sure the shotgun was loaded, while Evelyn huddled in the corner with Margaret pressed close to her chest. A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Now, Mr. Mercer, let's not play games. I know my dear sister's friend paid you a visit tonight, and I know what she brought with her. I'm prepared to be reasonable about this, but my patience has limits." "Anna never mentioned having a brother," Caleb replied, moving closer to the door while keeping the shotgun pointed toward it. "If you were family, why didn't you come to her funeral? Why didn't you help when she was sick?" The silence that followed was long enough that Caleb began to wonder if the men had simply left. Then Barrett's voice came again, colder now, with the pretense of civility beginning to fray around the edges. "My sister made her choices when she married an Irish immigrant and turned her back on her own blood," he said. "But the child is different. She carries my family's name, and she's entitled to certain protections and opportunities that you simply cannot provide. The child has a name." Caleb shot back, anger beginning to override his caution. "Her name is Margaret, and she's my daughter." "Margaret Crowley," Barrett corrected, and there was satisfaction in his voice at having provoked this reaction. "Born to Anna Crowley in the Riverside Sanatorium on October 15th of this year. The birth certificate lists no father, which means she belongs to her mother's family by default." Caleb felt his world tilt again as another piece of information he hadn't known fell into place. Anna had kept her maiden name at the sanatorium, probably to protect him from any legal complications that might arise from her death. But that decision had also left Margaret legally vulnerable to claims from relatives he didn't even know she had. "Even if that's true," Caleb said, "it doesn't give you the right to just take her. She needs stability, love, a real home. And I can provide all of those things," Barrett replied smoothly. "I have a large house in a respectable neighborhood, servants to help care for her, and the resources to ensure she receives the finest education available. What can you offer her, Mr. Mercer? This squalid apartment? The uncertain income of a man who hasn't worked in 2 years?" The company of drunks and immigrants and everyone else decent society prefers to forget. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, and Caleb could feel his temper rising in response to the calculated insults. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think tactically rather than emotionally. Barrett Crowley hadn't come here alone, and he hadn't come unprepared. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of money, intimidation, and violence. "I can offer her a father who loves her," Caleb said simply. "Can you say the same?" Another pause, shorter this time but somehow more ominous. When Barrett spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly through the thin door. "Love is a luxury, Mr. Mercer. Protection is a necessity. In this city, in this world, a child needs more than sentiment to survive. She needs connections, influence, the kind of power that keeps the wolves at bay." The sound of footsteps suggested he was moving closer to the door. "I'm offering you a chance to do what's best for her. Don't let pride make you choose poorly." Caleb looked over at Evelyn, who was staring at him with desperate hope in her eyes. Margaret had begun to fuss slightly, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, and Evelyn was rocking her gently while whispering soft words of comfort. The sight of them, this young woman who had already sacrificed so much for his daughter, and the baby who represented everything good that remained of his life with Anna, strengthened his resolve. "The answer is no," he called out, raising the shotgun to shoulder height. "Margaret stays with me." The response was immediate and chilling. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Mercer. Truly unfortunate." Barrett's voice had gone completely cold now, all pretense of negotiation abandoned. "Perhaps you'll reconsider when you've had more time to think about what's at stake. We'll return at dawn, and I suggest you use the intervening hours wisely." The sound of retreating footsteps echoed through the building, but Caleb knew better than to believe they had actually left. Men like Barrett Crowley didn't make threats and then simply walk away. They positioned themselves strategically and waited for their opponents to make mistakes. Part 5. Ultimatum until dawn. Caleb remained frozen by the door for several long minutes, the shotgun heavy in his hands as he strained to hear any sound that might indicate whether Crowley's men were truly gone or simply lying in wait. The building around them had fallen into an unnatural silence. No creaking floorboards from neighboring apartments. No sounds of conversation or movement that usually characterized the tenement even at this late hour. It was as if the entire structure was holding its breath, waiting to see what violence might erupt in its halls. "They're still out there," Evelyn whispered from her corner, her voice barely audible above Margaret's soft breathing. "Barrett doesn't make idle threats. If he says he'll return at dawn, he will. And he'll bring more men with him." Caleb carefully lowered the shotgun but kept it within easy reach as he moved away from the door. "Tell me about him," he said, settling into his chair across from Evelyn. "Tell me everything Anna never told me about her brother." Evelyn shifted Margaret to a more comfortable position in her arms, her face troubled as she gathered her thoughts. Anna rarely spoke of her family, even at the sanatorium when the other patients would share stories of their childhoods. But when the fever was very bad, sometimes she would talk in her sleep, and I learned more than she probably would have wanted me to know. She paused, looking down at the baby with an expression of infinite tenderness. "Barrett wasn't always what he is now. Anna said that when they were children in County Cork, he was protective of her, gentle even. Their parents died in the potato blight when Anna was barely 10, and Barrett was only 14, but he kept them both alive through the worst of it. He was the one who saved enough money for their passage to America, the one who found them work when they arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on their backs." Caleb felt a grudging respect for the man who had threatened his family, understanding the kind of strength and determination it would have taken for a teenage boy to keep himself and his younger sister alive during one of Ireland's darkest periods. But that didn't explain how that protective brother had become the kind of man who would try to steal a child from her father. "What changed him?" Caleb asked. "The city," Evelyn replied simply. "Anna said that Barrett learned quickly that honest work would never be enough to lift them out of poverty, that the only way to gain real power in New York was to take it from someone else. He started small, running messages for bookmakers, collecting debts for loan sharks. But he was smart and he was ruthless when he needed to be, and before long he had carved out his own territory in the maze of streets and alleys that make up the Lower East Side. She looked up at Caleb with haunted eyes. Anna said she watched her brother's soul die a little more each day, until the gentle boy who had saved her from starvation was completely gone, replaced by a man who saw every relationship as a transaction and every person as either an asset or a threat. The picture Evelyn painted was one Caleb recognized from his own experiences in the city. New York had a way of grinding down the hopes and dreams of immigrants, forcing them to choose between their principles and their survival. He had seen good men turn to drink, violence, or worse simply because the alternative was watching their families slowly starve in the tenements that packed human beings together like cargo in a ship's hold. Why did Anna cut ties with him? Caleb asked. Because she refused to let the city change her the way it had changed Barrett, Evelyn replied. When she met you, she saw a chance to build something clean and honest, something that couldn't be bought or stolen or corrupted. Barrett saw it as a betrayal, not just of him personally, but of everything they had suffered together to survive. Margaret began to fuss in Evelyn's arms, making the small sounds that indicated hunger or discomfort. Without thinking, Caleb reached out to take his daughter, marveling again at how natural it felt to hold her, how perfectly she seemed to fit against his chest. The baby settled immediately at her father's touch, her tiny hand grasping at his shirt as if anchoring herself to this new source of warmth and safety. She'll need to be fed soon, Evelyn said, reaching into her satchel to retrieve a small glass bottle filled with milk. Mrs. Goldstein taught me how to prepare formula when it became clear that nursing wouldn't be possible. The reminder of everything Evelyn had done to keep Margaret alive and healthy filled Caleb with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. This young woman, who clearly had troubles enough of her own, had taken on the responsibility of caring for a dying woman's child simply because it was the right thing to do. In a city that often seemed designed to crush such selfless impulses, her kindness shone like a beacon. Why? He asked suddenly. Why did you do all this? You could have left Margaret at an orphanage, or found some other family to take her in. Why seek me out specifically? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers nervously working at the edge of her shawl. Because Anna saved my life, she said finally. Not in any dramatic way. She simply showed me that it was possible to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. When I arrived at the sanatorium, I was ready to give up. My husband had died in a factory accident. My own health was failing, and I had no family left to care whether I lived or died. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she continued. Anna took me under her wing from the very first day. She shared her food when I was too weak to eat the hospital meals. She read to me when the fever made it impossible to focus on words. She held my hand during the worst nights when the coughing wouldn't stop. She gave me a reason to fight when I had forgotten why my life was worth preserving. Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion as he imagined his wife, dying and in pain, still finding the strength to comfort and care for another suffering soul. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly Anna, the woman who had once spent her last dollar buying food for a neighbor's hungry children, who had never walked past a stray animal without stopping to offer what help she could. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure Margaret found her way to you, Evelyn continued. She said that even if you weren't ready to be a father, even if the grief had made you forget how to love, the baby would remind you of all the reasons life was worth living. Looking down at Margaret's peaceful face, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing against his chest, Caleb knew that Anna had been right. For the first time in 2 years, he could imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival, a purpose that went deeper than simply avoiding the pain of remembering what he had lost. But that future was threatened by the men waiting in the shadows outside his building, and Caleb knew that dawn would bring a confrontation he wasn't prepared to face alone. Part 6. Seeking an ally. As the hours crept toward midnight, Caleb found himself pacing the small apartment like a caged animal, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. Barrett Crowley had all the advantages: money, manpower, and the kind of connections that could make inconvenient people disappear without attracting unwanted attention from the authorities. Against such resources, one aging firefighter with a shotgun and a fierce desire to protect his daughter seemed woefully inadequate. There has to be someone, he muttered, more to himself than to Evelyn. Someone who owes me a favor. Someone with enough influence to make Crowley think twice about pressing this. Evelyn looked up from where she sat feeding Margaret, her expression skeptical. Barrett owns half the police in this district, and most of the judges have learned not to ask too many questions about his business dealings. What kind of person could stand against that kind of power? Caleb stopped pacing abruptly as a memory surfaced from the depths of his grief-clouded mind. Sam Fletcher, he said, snapping his fingers as the pieces fell into place. Sam Fletcher in Harlem. He runs a garage up there, fixes automobiles for some very important people. How important? Evelyn asked, though something in Caleb's tone had sparked hope in her eyes. Important enough that when their expensive machines break down, they don't ask questions about the color of the man fixing them, Caleb replied. Sam and I served in the same fire company for 3 years before he decided to try his hand at mechanics. Best man I ever worked with, steady under pressure, loyal to his friends, and tougher than a coffin nail when circumstances required it. He moved to the window and peered carefully through the curtains, noting the shadows that lurked in doorways and alley mouths throughout the neighborhood. Crowley's men were positioned strategically, cutting off the most obvious escape routes while maintaining surveillance on the building. But they were watching for someone trying to flee with a baby, not a lone man who knew the back alleys and hidden passages of the Lower East Side like the scars on his own hands. I need to get to Sam's garage, Caleb said, turning back to Evelyn. But I can't leave you and Margaret here alone, and I can't risk taking her out into the cold with Crowley's men watching every exit. There's a way, Evelyn said quietly. Mrs. Goldstein's boarding house has a network of tunnels and connected basements that date back to the old Dutch settlements. The women there have used them before when certain men became too persistent in their attentions. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You're talking about smuggling routes. Among other things, Evelyn confirmed. The tunnels connect to the subway construction sites, and from there you could reach Harlem without ever setting foot on a street where Barrett's men might spot you. The plan was risky, but Caleb could see no alternative that didn't involve either surrendering Margaret to her uncle or attempting to fight off a small army with nothing but righteous anger and a double-barrel shotgun. He quickly gathered his coat and the few dollars he had hidden away for emergencies, then knelt beside Evelyn and gently touched Margaret's cheek. I'll be back before dawn, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. I won't let them take her. I know, Evelyn replied, covering his hand with her own. Anna chose well when she chose you. Margaret is lucky to have you as her father. The journey through the underground passages was a nightmare of narrow tunnels, freezing water, and the constant fear of discovery. Caleb crawled through drainage pipes barely wide enough for his shoulders, waded through ankle-deep sewage that reeked of decay and industrial waste, and climbed rickety ladders that groaned ominously under his weight. More than once he lost his way in the maze of passages, forced to backtrack through sections he had already traversed while precious minutes ticked away toward dawn. But finally, after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 90 minutes, he emerged from a maintenance tunnel into the basement of a Harlem tenement building. The contrast between the freezing underground passages and the warm, dry basement was so pronounced that Caleb spent several minutes simply standing still, letting his body adjust to the change in temperature. Sam Fletcher's garage occupied the ground floor of a converted stable, its wide doors flanked by windows that glowed with warm yellow light even at this late hour. Caleb could hear the sound of metal on metal coming from inside, the rhythmic hammering that indicated someone was working on a particularly stubborn mechanical problem. He knocked on the side door, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, a signal he and Sam had developed during their firefighting days to identify themselves during emergency situations. The hammering stopped immediately, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crossing the garage floor. Well, I'll be damned, Sam Fletcher said as he opened the door, his dark face breaking into a wide grin that quickly faded as he took in Caleb's disheveled appearance and haunted expression. Cal Mercer, you look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself. Get in here before you catch your death. Sam Fletcher was a big man, nearly as tall as Caleb but broader through the shoulders and chest, with hands that could bend steel bars or thread the finest needles with equal skill. His overalls were stained with grease and motor oil, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal arms corded with muscle from years of heavy labor. But it was his eyes that had always impressed Caleb most: intelligent, compassionate eyes that missed nothing and judged fairly. "Sam, I need help," Caleb said without preamble as his friend closed and locked the door behind him. "The kind of help that might get you in trouble with some very dangerous people." Sam's expression grew serious, but he didn't hesitate. "What kind of trouble we talking about?" Caleb quickly outlined the situation: Anna's death, Margaret's existence, Barrett Crowley's threats, and the impossible choice between surrendering his daughter or fighting a war he couldn't hope to win. Sam listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. "This Barrett Crowley," Sam said when Caleb had finished. "He's the one runs the protection rackets down in Little Italy?" "Among other things," Caleb confirmed. "You know him?" Sam's laugh was devoid of humor. "Know of him. He tried to muscle in on some of my clients a few months back, suggested that their expensive automobiles might be prone to unfortunate accidents if they didn't purchase his insurance policies. I persuaded him that such accidents would be bad for everyone's health." "How did you manage that?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Let's just say that some of my clients have friends who make Barrett Crowley look like a choir boy," Sam replied. "Men who fought in Cuba and the Philippines. Men who understand that sometimes violence is the only language certain people speak fluently." Part 7: The First Attack. While Caleb was making his way through the underground tunnels toward Harlem, the situation at his apartment was deteriorating rapidly. Evelyn had managed to get Margaret fed and settled, but the baby seemed to sense the tension in the air and refused to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Each small cry or fussy sound made Evelyn's heart race with fear that the noise might draw unwanted attention from the men watching the building. She had positioned herself in the corner farthest from the windows, surrounded by the heaviest furniture she could move quietly, with Margaret's makeshift crib placed behind an overturned table that would provide at least some protection if the situation turned violent. The shotgun Caleb had left behind was propped within easy reach, though Evelyn had never fired such a weapon and wasn't sure she would be able to use it effectively if the need arose. The attack came just after 2 in the morning, when Evelyn's exhaustion was beginning to overcome her vigilance. She had dozed off in her chair, Margaret finally sleeping peacefully in her arms, when the sound of splintering would jerk her back to full awareness. Someone was forcing open the rear door of the building, the one that led up from the alley behind the tenement. Evelyn's first instinct was to grab the shotgun, but as she reached for the weapon, Margaret woke with a sharp cry of distress. The baby's wail echoed through the apartment like a signal flare, advertising their exact location to whoever was climbing the back stairs with such deliberate stealth. "Quiet, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered frantically, bouncing Margaret gently in an attempt to soothe her back to sleep. "Please, you have to be quiet." But Margaret, perhaps sensing her caregiver's fear, only cried louder. The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew closer, accompanied by low voices speaking in the kind of urgent whispers that suggested professional criminals coordinating their approach. Evelyn managed to reach the shotgun just as the apartment's back door exploded inward, revealing a thin man in expensive clothes who moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to violence. He wasn't one of the men who had accompanied Barrett Crowley earlier. This was someone else, someone younger and hungrier, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested he enjoyed his work more than was strictly professional. Well, the intruder said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Evelyn couldn't immediately place. "Looks like we found the little bird and her chick." Evelyn raised the shotgun as best she could while still holding Margaret, but the weapon was too heavy and unwieldy for her to manage effectively with one arm. The man saw her struggle and laughed, pulling a pistol from inside his coat with casual confidence. "Now, miss, let's not do anything foolish," he said, advancing slowly into the apartment. "Mr. Crowley just wants what belongs to his family. Nobody needs to get hurt here." "She doesn't belong to him," Evelyn said, surprised by the strength in her own voice despite the terror that was making her hands shake. She belongs with her father. Her father is a drunk and a has-been who can't even take care of himself, let alone a baby, the man replied, still moving closer. Mr. Crowley can give her everything: education, society, a future worth having. What can Mercer give her except poverty and disappointment? Margaret's cries had subsided to whimpers, but she remained restless in Evelyn's arms, her tiny hands grasping at the air, as if searching for something to hold on to. The sight of the baby's distress filled Evelyn with a fierce protective rage that she had never experienced before, a primal fury that burned away her fear and replaced it with crystal-clear determination. He can give her love, Evelyn said, her finger finding the shotgun's trigger. Can Barrett Crowley say the same? The man's expression hardened. Love doesn't put food on the table or keep the wolves away from the door. Now put down that gun before you hurt someone. Instead, Evelyn swung the barrel toward the fireplace, where Caleb kept his supply of kindling and old newspapers. The blast was deafening in the small space, but it achieved exactly what she had hoped. The dry wood and paper exploded into flame, creating a sudden barrier of fire between herself and the intruder. The man cursed and stumbled backward, shielding his eyes from the sudden flare of light. In that moment of confusion, Evelyn heard the sound she had been praying for: heavy footsteps pounding up the front stairs, accompanied by familiar voices shouting her name. "Evelyn, where are you?" It was Caleb's voice, rough with exhaustion and fear but unmistakably real. "Here," she called back, never taking her eyes off the intruder who was now trapped between the spreading fire and the apartment's front door. "Be careful, he has a gun." The door burst open to reveal not just Caleb but Sam Fletcher as well, both men armed and clearly prepared for violence. The intruder spun toward this new threat, raising his pistol, but Sam was faster. The big mechanic's wrench caught the gunman in the wrist with a sickening crack, sending the weapon spinning across the floor to land in the growing flames. "You picked the wrong family to mess with," Sam growled, grabbing the injured man by the collar and hauling him toward the window. With casual strength, he lifted the intruder and thrust him halfway out the opening, holding him suspended 2 stories above the alley below. "Now then," Sam continued in a conversational tone, "you're going to deliver a message to your boss for me. You tell Barrett Crowley that if he wants this baby, he'll have to go through me and my friends to get her. And trust me when I say that's not a fight he wants to start." The man nodded frantically, his face pale with pain and terror. Sam held him there for another long moment, letting the threat sink in, then hauled him back inside and shoved him toward the door. "Get out," Sam ordered, "and if I see you or any of Crowley's other boys around here again, I won't be nearly so gentle." The intruder fled without another word, clutching his broken wrist and stumbling down the stairs in his haste to escape. Caleb quickly moved to stamp out the fire Evelyn had started, while Sam secured the damaged door as best he could with the limited materials available. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked, taking Margaret from Evelyn's trembling arms and checking both of them for injuries. "Did he touch you?" "We're fine," Evelyn assured him, though her voice was shaky with delayed reaction. "Margaret was fussy, but she's not hurt. I think she was just scared by all the noise." Caleb held his daughter close, marveling again at how perfectly she fit against his chest, how her presence seemed to calm the storm of rage and fear that had been building inside him since Sam had agreed to help. But even as he took comfort in her warmth, he knew that this was only the beginning. Barrett Crowley had tested their defenses and found them wanting. The next attack would be larger, more coordinated, and far more dangerous. Part 8. The choice: run or fight. Dawn was still hours away, but the apartment felt exposed and vulnerable now that Crowley's men knew exactly where to find them. The damaged rear door hung askew on its hinges, and the acrid smell of smoke from Evelyn's desperate fire still lingered in the air, like a warning of worse violence to come. Sam had done his best to secure the entrance, but they all knew it was a temporary measure at best. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, his voice grim with the weight of hard decisions. "Crowley will be back with more men, and next time they won't underestimate us." Sam nodded his agreement while continuing to work on the door barricade. That boy I threw out the window will be running straight back to his boss, probably embellishing the story to make himself look less like a coward. By sunrise, this place will be crawling with every thug and cutthroat Crowley can scrape together. Evelyn, who had been tending to Margaret while the men secured the apartment, looked up with determination burning in her eyes. Then we leave. Tonight. Before they can organize a proper assault. And go where? Caleb asked. Crowley owns half the Lower East Side, and his influence reaches into Brooklyn and Queens as well. There's nowhere in the city we could hide that he couldn't eventually find us. Sam straightened up from his work, wiping grease and sawdust from his hands on a rag that had seen better days. Not the city, maybe, but I know a place up north, near the Bronx. Old warehouse complex that's been abandoned since the economic panic 5 years ago. Used to belong to a friend of mine who got himself killed in a labor dispute. He moved to the window and peered carefully through the curtains, checking the positions of the watchers who still lurked in the shadows below. Place is isolated, defensible, and far enough from Crowley's usual territory that we might have time to figure out our next move. Caleb felt a spark of hope at the suggestion, but pragmatism quickly dampened his enthusiasm. What about supplies? Food, medicine for Margaret, warm clothes? We can't just disappear into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Already thought of that, Sam replied with a grin that reminded Caleb why he had always trusted this man with his life. I've got a truck outside, loaded with everything we'll need for at least a week. Food, blankets, medical supplies, even some toys I picked up for the little one. Evelyn stared at him in amazement. You planned all this while Caleb was explaining the situation? Experience, Sam said simply. When you've lived through as many emergencies as I have, you learn to think 3 steps ahead. The moment Cal told me about Crowley's ultimatum, I knew we'd need an escape route and a safe place to regroup. But even as they began to discuss the logistics of their escape, Caleb found himself wrestling with doubts that went deeper than mere tactical concerns. Running away felt like abandoning everything that Anna had worked to build: their home, their community, their dreams of raising a family in the city that had brought them together. More than that, it felt like letting Barrett Crowley win, allowing him to use fear and violence to tear apart what remained of Anna's legacy. There's another option, Caleb said suddenly, his voice carrying a tone that made both Sam and Evelyn stop what they were doing and look at him with concern. What kind of option? Sam asked, though something in his friend's expression suggested he already suspected what Caleb was thinking. We make our stand here, Caleb replied, moving to the window and looking down at the street where Crowley's men maintained their vigil. We turn this building into a fortress and make it clear that anyone who wants Margaret will have to go through us to get her. Sam shook his head immediately. That's suicide, Cal. We're 3 people against God knows how many professional killers. Even if we had enough ammunition to hold them off, which we don't, eventually they'd just burn the building down around us. Maybe, Caleb acknowledged, but at least we'd be fighting for something that matters. At least Margaret would know that her father didn't run when things got difficult. Evelyn, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up with a firmness that surprised both men. Margaret won't know anything if we're all dead, she said. And Anna didn't sacrifice her life to give birth to this child, just so we could throw our lives away in some grand gesture of defiance. She stood up, still holding the baby, and moved to stand directly in front of Caleb. Anna asked me to make sure Margaret found her way to you, but she also made me promise that I would protect her daughter above all else. That means keeping her alive, not getting her killed in a war that can't be won. The words stung because they carried the weight of truth, but they also forced Caleb to confront the real reason he was considering making a suicidal last stand. It wasn't about protecting Margaret or honoring Anna's memory. It was about his own anger, his own need to strike back at a world that had taken everything he loved and now threatened to take what little remained. You're right, he said finally, the admission feeling like a physical weight being lifted from his shoulders. Both of you are right. We run, we hide, and we figure out how to fight Crowley on our own terms. Sam clapped him on the shoulder with genuine relief. Now you're thinking like the man I used to work alongside. Strategic, not emotional. That's how we stay alive long enough to win this thing. They worked quickly to gather what few possessions were worth saving: Anna's journal, some photographs, the small amount of money Caleb had hidden away, and the basic supplies needed to care for Margaret during their journey. Everything else would have to be abandoned, left behind like so many other dreams that had fallen victim to the harsh realities of urban life. As they prepared to leave, Caleb took one last look around the apartment that had been his home for 6 years. This was where he had brought Anna as a new bride, where they had planned their future together during long evenings by the fire, where he had retreated to lick his wounds after her death. Now it would become just another empty space in a city full of abandoned dreams and broken promises. But as he looked down at Margaret, sleeping peacefully in Evelyn's arms despite the chaos swirling around her, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Anna might be gone, but she had left him with something precious to protect, something worth fighting for even if it meant giving up everything else. "Let's go," he said quietly, shouldering the bag that contained their few remaining possessions. "It's time to disappear." Part 9. Ambush in the Forest Park. The journey north took them through the darkest hours before dawn, Sam's truck rattling along rutted roads that wound through industrial districts and immigrant neighborhoods where the city gradually gave way to scattered farms and wooded hills. They had made it past the immediate danger zone around Caleb's apartment without incident, but all 3 adults remained tense and watchful, knowing that Barrett Crowley's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of the Lower East Side. Margaret had settled into a peaceful sleep shortly after they began moving, lulled by the steady vibration of the truck's engine and the gentle swaying motion as Sam navigated the increasingly rough terrain. Evelyn held her securely in the passenger seat, while Caleb sat in the truck bed with the supplies, his shotgun ready and his eyes constantly scanning the road behind them for signs of pursuit. The abandoned warehouse complex Sam had described was located in a remote section of what would someday become Pelham Bay Park, surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt track that branched off from the main road like a secret pathway into another world. As they approached the turnoff, Sam slowed the truck and peered carefully into the shadows between the trees. "Something's not right," he said, his voice cutting through the engine noise with sharp concern. "There should be tire tracks in the mud from my earlier trips up here, but I'm seeing fresh marks that don't match my truck's wheels." Caleb immediately raised his weapon and chambered around, the mechanical sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. "How fresh?" "Fresh enough that whoever made them is probably still here," Sam replied, bringing the truck to a complete stop about 50 yards from the turnoff. "Could be hunters or vagrants looking for shelter, but you don't believe that any more than I do," Caleb finished grimly. "Crowley's men got here ahead of us." The realization hit them all simultaneously. Barrett Crowley was more than just a neighborhood gangster with local connections. He had resources and intelligence networks that allowed him to anticipate their moves and position his forces accordingly. The warehouse that was supposed to be their sanctuary had become a trap, and they had driven straight into it like sheep following a Judas goat to slaughter. "We need to turn around," Evelyn whispered urgently, shifting Margaret to a more protective position in her arms. "Go back the way we came and find another route." But even as she spoke, the sound of engines starting up echoed from multiple directions around them. Headlights blazed to life in the woods on both sides of the road, revealing at least 4 vehicles that had been positioned to cut off any retreat. Sam cursed under his breath and threw the truck into reverse, but more lights appeared behind them, completing the encirclement. "Out of the truck!" Sam shouted, grabbing his rifle from the rack behind the driver's seat. "Into the woods! It's our only chance." They abandoned the vehicle just as the first shots began to ring out, muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like deadly fireflies. Caleb helped Evelyn out of the passenger side while Sam provided covering fire, his rifle cracking steadily as he aimed at the approaching headlights. Glass shattered and metal screamed as their bullets found their targets. But there were too many attackers spread across too wide an area for 3 people to hold off indefinitely. "This way," Caleb called, leading them into the densest part of the woods where the bare winter branches would provide at least some concealment. Behind them, he could hear men shouting orders and organizing pursuit, their voices carrying the professional calm of experienced hunters who knew their prey was trapped. The forest floor was treacherous in the darkness, covered with fallen logs, hidden roots, and patches of ice that threatened to send them sprawling with every step. Evelyn struggled to keep up while protecting Margaret, who had awakened and begun crying at the sudden eruption of violence around her. The baby's wails seemed to echo through the trees like a beacon, advertising their location to anyone within half a mile. The crying, Caleb panted as they stumbled through a particularly dense thicket. "Can you quiet her? She's terrified," Evelyn replied, trying to bounce Margaret gently while maintaining their desperate pace. "She can sense that we're all afraid, and it's making her panic too." Sam, who had been bringing up the rear and periodically turning to fire at their pursuers, suddenly grabbed Caleb's arm and pointed toward a rocky outcropping about 100 yards to their left. "There," he said. "Those rocks will give us some cover and a better field of fire. We can make our stand there." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than continuing to stumble blindly through the forest while their enemies closed in from all sides. They changed direction and began climbing toward the rocky formation, their breath coming in visible puffs in the frigid air as they pushed their exhausted bodies beyond normal limits. They reached the rocks just as the first of their pursuers emerged from the tree line below. Caleb counted at least 8 men, all armed with rifles or pistols, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of military veterans or professional criminals. These weren't street thugs or casual muscle. They were serious operators who had been brought in specifically to handle a dangerous situation. "Spread out and watch your crossfire," one of the men called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Crowley wants the baby alive," but he didn't say anything about the adults. The words sent ice through Caleb's veins as he realized the full implications of their situation. Barrett Crowley had never intended to negotiate or find a peaceful solution to their conflict. From the very beginning, his plan had been to eliminate everyone who stood between him and Margaret, then claim the child as his rightful inheritance. "Sam," Caleb whispered, checking his ammunition and finding it dangerously low. "How many rounds do you have left?" "Maybe a dozen," Sam replied, his voice grim. "Not nearly enough for 8 professional killers." Below them, the attackers had begun to advance up the slope, using the trees for cover as they closed the distance to their rocky fortress. Muzzle flashes lit up the forest as they laid down suppressing fire, their bullets whining off the stone and sending chips flying in all directions. Part 10. Crowley loses control. The sound of approaching footsteps through the underbrush announced the arrival of someone new to the battlefield, and Caleb felt his heart sink as he recognized the voice that called out from the darkness below. "Enough!" Barrett Crowley's command cut through the gunfire like a blade, causing his men to cease their advance immediately. "I want to talk to them." A tall figure emerged from behind one of the larger trees, silhouetted against the faint light beginning to filter through the forest canopy. Even in the dim pre-dawn gloom, Caleb could see that Barrett Crowley was exactly what he had expected, expensively dressed despite the rough terrain, carrying himself with the confident arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and violence. "Mr. Mercer," Crowley called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "This has gone on quite long enough, don't you think? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. There's no shame in accepting the inevitable." "The inevitable being what, exactly?" Caleb replied, keeping his shotgun trained on the area where Crowley's voice was coming from. "You murdering me and taking my daughter?" Crowley's laugh was genuinely amused, as if Caleb had said something particularly witty. "Murder? My dear fellow, I'm not a common criminal. I'm a businessman who prefers to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence." "Funny way of negotiating," Sam called out from his position behind a different boulder. "Most business meetings I've attended didn't involve quite so many guns." "Ah, the famous Sam Fletcher," Crowley replied, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "I've heard interesting things about you from some mutual acquaintances. Men who learned to appreciate your particular talents during the recent unpleasantness in Cuba." The reference to Sam's military service caught Caleb by surprise. He had known his friend was a veteran, but Sam had never spoken in detail about his experiences in the Spanish-American War. The fact that Crowley had researched Sam's background suggested a level of preparation and intelligence gathering that was deeply troubling. "What do you want?" Evelyn called out suddenly, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear, but still carrying a core of defiance that impressed both men. "What could possibly be worth all this violence?" "I want what's mine," Crowley replied, his tone becoming colder and more businesslike. "My sister may have chosen to abandon her family and marry beneath her station, but the child carries my blood. She's entitled to the opportunities and protections that only I can provide." "Anna never mentioned having any family," Caleb said. "If you cared so much about her welfare, where were you when she was dying of consumption in that hospital?" The silence that followed was long enough that Caleb began to wonder if Crowley had simply walked away. When the gangster finally spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. "My sister made her choices," he said, and there was genuine pain beneath the anger in those words. "She chose an Irish immigrant over her own flesh and blood. She chose poverty and disease over the security I could have provided. She chose to die alone in a charity hospital rather than accept my help." The raw emotion in Crowley's voice revealed more about the family dynamics than hours of explanation could have conveyed. This wasn't just about controlling Margaret or gaining access to some mysterious inheritance. This was about a brother's guilt over letting his sister slip away, about his desperate need to possess the only thing she had left behind. "Anna didn't die alone," Evelyn called out, her voice growing stronger. "She died surrounded by people who loved her, people who cared about her as a person rather than as a piece of property to be owned." "You know nothing about what Anna needed," Crowley snarled back. "Nothing about the sacrifices I made to keep us both alive when we first came to this country. Nothing about the compromises I had to make so that she could afford to play at being a respectable married woman." The conversation was interrupted by a new sound, the distant wail of sirens approaching through the forest roads. Someone had heard the gunfire and alerted the authorities, and now the New York Police Department was racing toward their location with every intention of restoring order through whatever means necessary. "Sounds like your party's about to get crashed," Sam observed with grim satisfaction. "Hope you've got your story straight about why you brought an army into the woods to terrorize a woman and her baby." But Crowley's response was not what any of them expected. Instead of panic or concern about police involvement, he began to laugh, a sound devoid of humor that raised the hair on the back of Caleb's neck. "The police," Crowley said. "You think I'm worried about a few Irish cops who can barely read their own badges? Half of them are on my payroll, and the other half know better than to interfere in my business." The sirens were getting closer now, but instead of retreating, Crowley's men began to advance again, moving with renewed urgency as if the approaching authorities represented an opportunity rather than a threat. Caleb realized with growing horror that the police weren't coming to rescue them. They were coming to help Barrett Crowley clean up the mess. "Last chance, Mercer," Crowley called out. "Surrender the child now, and I'll make sure the police report shows that you died resisting arrest rather than being executed for kidnapping." The offer was clearly meant to sound generous, but Caleb could hear the underlying threat. Barrett Crowley had enough influence to control the official narrative of whatever happened here. Margaret would be found in the care of her loving uncle after her father's tragic death during a criminal pursuit, and no one would ever question the story closely enough to uncover the truth. "Go to hell," Caleb replied and opened fire. The shotgun blast echoed through the forest like thunder, followed immediately by Sam's rifle and the return fire from Crowley's men. But something had changed in the tactical situation. Instead of the coordinated advance they had maintained before, the attackers were now moving with desperate haste, trying to finish the fight before the approaching sirens could complicate their carefully laid plans. In the chaos of muzzle flashes and ricocheting bullets, Caleb saw his chance. While the attention of Crowley's men was focused on the rocky outcropping where Sam was providing covering fire, he slipped away from their position and began working his way around the flank of the attacking force. The police sirens were very close now, close enough that individual vehicles could be distinguished from the general wail of approaching authority. But Caleb no longer harbored any illusions about rescue. If anything, The arrival of corrupt cops would only make their situation more desperate. Moving through the underbrush with the stealth he had learned during childhood hunting trips in the Irish countryside, Caleb managed to get behind the line of attackers just as Barrett Crowley stepped out from behind his tree to get a better view of the battle. The gangster was focused entirely on the rocky outcropping where he believed all three of his enemies were trapped, completely unaware that death was approaching him from an unexpected direction. Caleb raised his shotgun and took careful aim at the man who had threatened his daughter and destroyed what remained of his peaceful life. At this range, there would be no chance of survival, no opportunity for last-minute negotiations or dramatic revelations. Barrett Crowley would simply cease to exist, taking his threats and his twisted sense of family obligation with him into whatever darkness awaited men who chose violence over love. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Caleb heard something that made him freeze. Margaret's cry, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the forest from somewhere far too close to the line of fire. Part 11, Secret Hideout and Decision. The realization that Margaret was no longer safely positioned behind the rocky outcropping sent ice through Caleb's veins. In the chaos of the firefight, Evelyn must have been forced to move, possibly wounded or driven from their defensive position by the increasing intensity of the gunfire. The baby's cries were coming from somewhere in the darkness between Caleb's current position and where Barrett Crowley stood directing his men's assault. Caleb lowered his shotgun and began moving carefully through the underbrush, following the sound of his daughter's distress while trying to avoid detection by either side in the ongoing battle. The police sirens had grown deafeningly close, and he could see the first flickers of red and blue light beginning to penetrate the forest canopy. But his entire world had narrowed to the desperate need to find Margaret before the situation deteriorated further. He found them in a small clearing about 30 yards from the main firefight. Evelyn crouched behind a fallen log with Margaret clutched protectively against her chest, both of them exposed and vulnerable in the crossfire between Crowley's men and Sam's increasingly desperate defensive efforts. Blood was seeping through Evelyn's sleeve, and her face was pale with shock and blood loss. But her grip on the baby remained firm and protective. "Thank God," she whispered as Caleb appeared beside her, relief flooding her features. "I thought we were going to die out here. What happened?" Caleb asked, quickly assessing her wound while keeping one eye on the battle raging nearby. "Bullet grazed my arm when I was trying to move to a better position," Evelyn explained, wincing as Caleb examined the injury. "Not serious, but it made me drop my bag and lose my bearings in the dark. I've been trying to find my way back to Sam, but everything looks the same in this forest." Margaret's cries had subsided to whimpers now that her father was present, but she remained agitated and frightened by the violence surrounding them. Caleb took her from Evelyn's arms and held her close, marveling again at how his presence seemed to calm her even in the midst of chaos. "We need to get out of here," he said, helping Evelyn to her feet while keeping Margaret secure in his other arm. "The police are about to arrive, and from what Crowley said, they're not coming to help us." But even as they prepared to flee deeper into the forest, the sound of approaching vehicles grew impossibly loud, and suddenly the woods were flooded with searchlights that turned night into harsh, artificial day. Police cars and unmarked black sedans were converging on their location from multiple directions, their occupants shouting orders and demands for surrender that echoed through the trees like the voices of hunting hounds. "This is the New York Police Department," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "You are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands visible." But the response from Barrett Crowley's position was immediate, and violent muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line as his men opened fire on the approaching officers, apparently having decided that a shootout with corrupt cops was preferable to whatever consequences might result from a peaceful surrender. "He's lost control," Evelyn breathed, staring in horror at the escalating battle. Crowley's lost control of the situation entirely. She was right. What had begun as a calculated effort to acquire custody of Margaret had devolved into a three-way war between rival criminal factions, with innocent lives caught in the crossfire. The police, whether corrupt or honest, were responding to the gunfire with overwhelming force, while Crowley's men seemed determined to fight to the death rather than face arrest. In the chaos, Caleb spotted an opportunity. While everyone's attention was focused on the main battle, He could see a narrow deer path that led away from the clearing toward what appeared to be an old stone structure partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. If they could reach it without being detected, it might provide the shelter they needed to wait out the violence and plan their next move. "Can you walk?" he asked Evelyn, noting how she favored her wounded arm. "I can manage," she replied, though her voice was tight with pain. "Where are we going?" "Away from here," Caleb said grimly. "Somewhere we can think without people shooting at us." The journey to the stone structure took nearly 20 minutes of careful movement through dense undergrowth, with frequent stops to avoid patrols of police officers who were systematically searching the forest for survivors of the gun battle. Behind them, the sounds of conflict continued: sporadic gunfire, shouted orders, and the occasional scream of someone who had been hit. The building they had spotted turned out to be an old groundskeeper's cottage, probably dating back to when this land had been part of a private estate before being abandoned to the city's expansion. The roof had partially collapsed and most of the windows were broken, but the stone walls were solid and the interior was dry. More importantly, it was far enough from the main battle that they could hear themselves think. Caleb quickly surveyed their supplies while Evelyn tended to Margaret, who had finally fallen back asleep despite the distant sounds of violence. They had managed to salvage a small amount of food, some medical supplies, and enough ammunition for perhaps one more serious firefight. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. "We can't stay here," Evelyn said, reading his thoughts as he inventoried their meager resources. "Sooner or later, someone will find this place, and we'll be trapped again." Caleb nodded, but his mind was already working on a different problem. "Crowley made a mistake tonight," he said slowly. "He revealed how far his corruption extends, how many people he has on his payroll. But he also showed that he's not invincible. When things went wrong, his men panicked just like anyone else." "What are you thinking?" Evelyn asked, though something in his tone had made her voice cautious. "I'm thinking that Barrett Crowley has spent so much time being the hunter that he's forgotten what it feels like to be the prey," Caleb replied, his voice taking on a hard edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm thinking it's time to remind him." Outside the cottage, the sounds of battle were beginning to diminish as the superior firepower and organization of the police finally overwhelmed Crowley's men. But Caleb knew that this temporary victory would solve nothing. Barrett Crowley himself had almost certainly escaped in the confusion, and as long as he remained free, Margaret would never be safe. "You're talking about going after him directly," Evelyn said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm talking about ending this," Caleb corrected. "Crowley thinks he can use fear and violence to get what he wants, but he's made one crucial error. He's threatened the only thing I have left to live for. That doesn't make me vulnerable. It makes me dangerous." Part 12: Revenge at the Mafia Courtyard. By the time the sun rose over the forest, the gun battle had ended and the surviving police officers were methodically searching the area for bodies and evidence. From their hiding place in the old cottage, Caleb and his companions could hear the voices of investigators calling out to each other as they cataloged the carnage. But they remained hidden and silent until the last official vehicle had departed. When they finally emerged from their shelter, the forest looked like a battlefield. Trees were scarred with bullet holes, the ground was littered with spent cartridges, and dark stains in the snow marked the spots where men had fallen and bled. But there was no sign of Barrett Crowley among the dead, confirming Caleb's suspicion that the gangster had managed to escape in the confusion. "Where would he go?" Sam asked as they picked their way carefully through the debris field. He had found them shortly after the police withdrew, having evaded capture by hiding in a drainage culvert for most of the night. His rifle was gone, probably confiscated as evidence, but he was otherwise unharmed. "Back to his territory," Caleb replied with certainty. "Back to the place where he feels most secure, where he has the most resources and the most loyal men around him." Evelyn, who had been quiet since their escape from the cottage, suddenly spoke up. "The furniture factory," she said. "Anna mentioned it once when she was delirious with fever. She said Barrett had bought an old furniture factory on the East River, that he used it as headquarters for his operations. The information fit with what Caleb knew about men like Crowley. They preferred to conduct their business from legitimate-seeming locations that could provide cover for their illegal activities. A furniture factory would have the added advantage of multiple entrances and exits, plenty of space for storing contraband, and a ready explanation for the constant flow of trucks and workers. You're talking about assaulting a fortified position with just the three of us, Sam pointed out, though his tone suggested he was analyzing the tactical situation rather than dismissing the idea entirely. Even if we could get inside, Crowley will have dozens of men protecting him. Not dozens, Caleb said, remembering the chaos of the forest battle. He lost at least 6 men last night, maybe more, and the ones who survived will be demoralized, wondering if their boss has lost his edge. That's when organizations like his become vulnerable, when the foot soldiers start questioning whether their leader can actually protect them. They spent the morning making their way back toward the city, avoiding main roads and staying to wooded areas where possible. Margaret remained quiet and alert during the journey, as if she sensed that her safety depended on their ability to remain undetected. Evelyn's wound was healing cleanly, and though she was still weak from blood loss, her determination to see the conflict through to its conclusion never wavered. By early afternoon, they had reached the industrial district along the East River, where massive factories and warehouses lined the waterfront like sleeping giants. The Crowley Furniture Company occupied a sprawling complex of brick buildings that had been constructed during the city's rapid expansion in the 1880s. Their smokestacks and loading docks designed to handle the enormous volume of goods that flowed through New York's port every day. From their observation point in an abandoned warehouse across the street, they could see that security around the factory was heavy but not impenetrable. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals, and every entrance was watched. But the men looked tired and nervous, the kind of exhaustion that came from staying alert for too many hours without relief. There, Sam said, pointing to a section of the factory complex where a loading dock extended over the water. That dock is the weak point. If we could get a boat, we could approach from the riverside where they won't be expecting trouble. Caleb studied the layout carefully, noting the positions of guards and the patterns of their movement. What about inside? Do we have any idea of the building's layout? Anna described it once, Evelyn said slowly, her voice distant as she accessed old memories. She said Barrett gave her a tour when he first bought the place, trying to impress her with his success. The main floor is set up as an actual furniture factory, with machinery and workers who probably don't know about the illegal activities. But the second floor is offices and meeting rooms, and the basement. She paused, her face troubled. What about the basement? Caleb prompted. Anna said it was where Barrett kept the things he didn't want anyone else to see. Records, money, and people who had crossed him. The implication was clear. If Barrett Crowley was going to make his last stand anywhere, it would be in the basement of his factory, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes and the instruments of his power. As evening approached, they finalized their plan. Sam had managed to borrow a small rowboat from a nearby marina, while Caleb and Evelyn prepared the weapons and supplies they would need for what was essentially a suicide mission. They all understood the odds they were facing, but they also understood that running would only postpone the inevitable. Barrett Crowley would never stop hunting Margaret as long as he remained alive. If something happens to me, Caleb said to Evelyn as they prepared to leave their hiding place, take Margaret and get as far away from New York as you can. Change her name. Start over somewhere Barrett's influence can't reach. Evelyn shook her head firmly. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said. Anna didn't send me to find you just so I could watch you die trying to protect your daughter. We're all going to survive this, and we're all going to see Margaret grow up safe and happy. The conviction in her voice was so strong that Caleb almost believed her. Almost. Part 13, the final battle. The approach from the river went exactly as planned until it didn't. They had managed to reach the loading dock without detection, tying off their small boat beneath the wooden platform where the shadows were deep enough to provide concealment. Sam had disabled the single guard stationed at the water entrance with a sleeper hold that would keep the man unconscious for at least an hour, and they had made it inside the factory through a service door that had been left carelessly unlocked. But as they crept through the darkened corridors of the main floor, moving between silent machinery and stacks of lumber that would become furniture in the morning, Caleb began to realize that something was wrong. The factory was too quiet, too empty, as if it had been deliberately cleared of workers and guards alike. It's a trap, Sam whispered, echoing Caleb's own thoughts. He knew we'd come here, and he's been waiting for us. Before Caleb could respond, floodlights blazed to life throughout the factory floor, turning their concealment into exposure and their advantage into vulnerability. Armed men emerged from hiding places among the machinery, at least a dozen of them, all with weapons trained on the three intruders who had walked so obligingly into Barrett Crowley's web. "Drop your weapons," a familiar voice commanded from somewhere above them. Looking up, Caleb could see Barrett Crowley standing on a catwalk that overlooked the factory floor, his expensive suit immaculate despite the night's earlier chaos. "You're surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. There's nowhere left to run." Caleb felt Evelyn press closer to him, Margaret still sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the sudden explosion of light and sound. The baby's trust in her protectors was absolute, even as those protectors faced the very real possibility of death in the next few minutes. "What do you want, Crowley?" Caleb called out, keeping his shotgun ready despite the overwhelming odds against them. "I want what I've always wanted," Crowley replied, beginning to descend a metal staircase that would bring him to the factory floor. "I want my niece. I want the last connection to my sister. I want to right the wrong that was done when Anna chose an Irish immigrant over her own family." As he spoke, Crowley's men began to close in, maintaining their weapons at the ready but clearly confident that their numerical superiority had ended any real threat. But they were making the same mistake that professional soldiers often made when facing desperate civilians. They were underestimating the fury of a parent protecting his child. "Anna didn't choose me over her family," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly across the factory floor. "She chose love over control. She chose hope over fear. She chose to build something new instead of being trapped by something old." Crowley reached the bottom of the stairs and began walking slowly across the open space between them, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of casual confidence. And what did that choice get her? A slow death in a charity hospital, abandoned by the man she loved, giving birth to a child who would grow up without either parent. The words were calculated to wound, and they succeeded. Caleb felt the familiar stab of guilt over Anna's death, the crushing weight of all the things he could have done differently, all the ways he had failed the woman who had loved him with such complete devotion. But then he felt Margaret stir in Evelyn's arms, her tiny hand reaching out toward his voice, and the guilt transformed into something harder and more focused. Barrett Crowley could use words as weapons all he wanted, but at the end of the day, he was still the man who had threatened an innocent child and murdered anyone who stood in his way. "Anna's not here to defend herself," Caleb said, raising his shotgun to point directly at Crowley's chest. "But I am." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the wail of sirens approaching the factory from multiple directions. But these weren't the corrupt police officers who had arrived at the forest battle. These were federal agents, and their presence meant that someone with real authority had finally decided to investigate Barrett Crowley's activities. "Impossible," Crowley breathed, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. "I own every cop in this district." "You own the local police?" a new voice said from the factory's main entrance. "You don't own us." The speaker was a tall man in a dark suit, flanked by at least 20 federal agents with rifles and pistols drawn. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, quickly surrounding Crowley's men and demanding their surrender with the kind of authority that came from badges issued in Washington rather than City Hall. In the confusion that followed, as Crowley's men realized they were caught between federal agents and desperate civilians, Sam Fletcher made his move. The big mechanic had been slowly working his way around the edge of the factory floor, using the machinery for cover, and now he emerged directly behind Barrett Crowley with his service revolver pressed against the gangster's neck. "Tell your men to stand down," Sam ordered, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced death before and found it less frightening than dishonor. But Barrett Crowley had not built his criminal empire by surrendering when the odds turned against him. Instead of complying with Sam's demand, he spun suddenly and struck out with a knife that had been concealed in his sleeve, aiming for the bigger man's throat with the speed and precision of someone who had killed with his own hands before. Sam was fast, but not fast enough to avoid the blade entirely. It scored across his shoulder, drawing blood and making him stumble backward, but his finger was already tightening on the trigger of his revolver. The gunshot echoed through the factory like thunder, and Barrett Crowley staggered, clutching his chest as blood began to seep between his fingers. "This isn't over," Crowley gasped, falling to his knees on the concrete floor. "There are other members of the family who will come for her." But even as he spoke, his voice was growing weaker, and his eyes were losing focus. Whatever other relatives might exist in Ireland or elsewhere, Barrett Crowley would not be there to coordinate their efforts or fund their pursuit. "Yes, it is," Caleb said quietly, kneeling beside the dying man. "It's over." Barrett Crowley died with his sister's name on his lips, whispering something in Irish that might have been a prayer or a curse. In the sudden silence that followed, Margaret woke up and began to cry, not from fear or distress, but simply because she was hungry and needed her father's attention. As Caleb took his daughter from Evelyn's arms and held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, he realized that Anna had been right about everything. Love was stronger than fear, hope was more powerful than despair, and family was defined not by blood or obligation, but by the choices people made every day to care for each other. The federal agents would need statements and evidence, there would be trials and investigations, and the newspapers would sensationalize the story of the gun battle in the forest and the final confrontation at the furniture factory. But all of that belonged to the future, and for now, Caleb was content to hold his daughter and listen to her breathing, knowing that she was safe and that Anna's sacrifice had not been in vain. Outside the factory windows, dawn was breaking over the East River, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that promised better days ahead. Part 14, Silence After the Storm. The federal investigation into Barrett Crowley's criminal enterprise would take months to complete, but the immediate threat to Margaret's safety had ended with her uncle's death in the furniture factory. The agents who had arrived so unexpectedly turned out to be part of a joint task force that had been building a case against Crowley for over a year, gathering evidence of corruption, racketeering, and murder that stretched from the docks of Manhattan to the political offices of Albany. Caleb learned later that their timely arrival had been orchestrated by Sam Fletcher, who had used his connections with certain influential clients to alert federal authorities about the ongoing conflict. The mechanic's reputation for discretion and reliability had made him a trusted confidant of several prominent businessmen and politicians, men who preferred to keep their expensive automobiles in perfect condition without having to answer uncomfortable questions about their association with a black-owned garage in Harlem. "Sometimes it pays to fix the right person's car," Sam had explained with characteristic understatement when Caleb pressed him for details about how he had managed to summon federal agents to their rescue. "And sometimes those people remember favors when you need them most." The weeks following Barrett Crowley's death passed in a blur of legal proceedings, newspaper interviews, and the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by violence and grief. Caleb found himself thrust unwillingly into the role of local hero, his story of protecting his infant daughter from a corrupt gangster capturing the imagination of journalists, who were always eager for tales of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary evil. But the attention was unwelcome and potentially dangerous. Every newspaper article that mentioned Margaret by name, every photograph that showed her face, was a potential beacon for other relatives or criminal associates who might decide that Anna's daughter represented either an opportunity or a threat. Caleb quickly learned to avoid reporters and to keep his family's location private, understanding that true security lay in anonymity rather than fame. The apartment building where he had lived with Anna was no longer safe or suitable for raising a child. Too many people knew about it, and too many memories haunted its rooms for Caleb to find peace there. Instead, he used a portion of the reward money offered by grateful federal investigators to purchase a small house in a quiet neighborhood in Queens, far enough from Manhattan to provide some insulation from his past, but close enough that he could still find work. Evelyn, whose courage during the crisis had impressed everyone who heard her story, was offered several opportunities to start fresh in other cities where charitable organizations promised to help her build a new life. But she chose to remain in New York, accepting a position as a teacher in a school that served the children of recent immigrants. Her experience caring for Margaret had awakened a maternal instinct that found its outlet in nurturing other people's children, and her multilingual skills made her invaluable in helping young students adapt to their new country. "I made a promise to Anna," she explained when Caleb asked why she had chosen to stay in a city that held so many painful memories. "I promised to help raise Margaret, to make sure she grew up knowing how much her mother loved her. That's not a responsibility I can fulfill from a distance." The arrangement that developed between them was unconventional but functional. Evelyn maintained her own small apartment near the school where she worked, but she spent most evenings and weekends at Caleb's house, helping to care for Margaret and gradually becoming the closest thing to a mother that the little girl would ever know. There was no romantic attachment between them. Anna's memory remained too fresh and powerful for Caleb to consider such a possibility, but there was deep friendship and mutual respect based on shared experience and common purpose. Margaret thrived in this environment of love and stability. She was a remarkably healthy and happy baby, with her father's red hair and her mother's blue eyes, and a temperament that seemed to combine the best qualities of both parents. She laughed easily and often, reaching for anyone who showed her kindness, but she reserved her brightest smiles for Caleb and Evelyn, recognizing them instinctively as the constants in her small world. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, Caleb found himself slowly emerging from the fog of grief that had enveloped him since Anna's death. Margaret's presence had given him a reason to live beyond mere survival, and caring for her daily needs had forced him to develop routines and habits that gradually restored his sense of purpose and self-worth. He returned to work as a firefighter, though with a different company in Queens that was closer to his new home. His colleagues there knew nothing of his recent notoriety, seeing him simply as an experienced fireman with steady nerves and good instincts. The familiar rhythms of the job, the sudden alarms, the rush to emergency scenes, the satisfaction of helping people in crisis, provided a welcome contrast to the domestic tranquility of his life with Margaret. But even as normalcy began to reassert itself, Caleb remained vigilant. Barrett Crowley had mentioned other family members who might have claims on Margaret, and the gangster's criminal organization had been damaged but not completely destroyed by his death and the federal investigation. There were still men out there who owed their livelihoods to the Crowley name, men who might see profit or revenge in pursuing Anna's daughter. Sam Fletcher shared these concerns and had quietly organized a network of friends and associates who kept watch over Caleb's neighborhood and reported anything suspicious. The big mechanic had emerged from the crisis with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged, as word spread through certain circles that he was a man who could be counted on when situations turned dangerous. His garage became an unofficial meeting place for veterans and working men who respected his combination of skill, loyalty, and quiet strength. The thing about men like Barrett Crowley, Sam observed during one of their regular Sunday dinners at Caleb's house, is that they never work alone. They build networks, they create dependencies, they establish relationships that survive even when they don't. Just because the head of the snake is dead doesn't mean the body has stopped moving. It was a sobering reminder that their victory over Barrett Crowley might have been decisive but was not necessarily final. In the complex world of organized crime and political corruption, revenge could be a dish served cold, and enemies could emerge from unexpected directions long after the original conflict seemed resolved. But as Caleb watched Margaret playing contentedly on a blanket in his backyard, reaching for dandelions and laughing at the antics of a neighbor's cat, he felt a peace that had been absent from his life for too long. Whatever threats might still lurk in the shadows, whatever challenges the future might bring, he had succeeded in the most important task Anna had entrusted to him. He had kept their daughter safe and given her a chance to grow up surrounded by love. The journal that Anna had written during her final months had become one of Margaret's most precious possessions, though she was still too young to understand its contents. Caleb read from it every night, sharing Anna's memories and dreams with the daughter who would never know her mother's voice except through these written words. The journal contained stories of their courtship and marriage, descriptions of the hopes they had shared for their future family, and detailed instructions about how Margaret should be raised to honor both her Irish heritage and her American opportunities. One passage, written during Anna's final week at the sanatorium, had become particularly meaningful to Caleb. "If you are reading this to our daughter, my beloved husband, then you have succeeded in giving her what I could not, a chance to live and grow and discover who she is meant to become. Do not let grief make you forget that love is stronger than death, that hope is more powerful than despair, and that the best way to honor my memory is to fill Margaret's life with all the joy and laughter that I will miss sharing with her. Part 15. But the war is not over. 3 months after Barrett Crowley's death, on a humid August evening when the air hung heavy with the promise of thunderstorms, the first sign of renewed danger appeared in the form of a well-dressed stranger who stood too long on the corner across from Caleb's house. The man was not obviously threatening. Indeed, he looked like any number of businessmen or government clerks who might have legitimate reasons for being in the neighborhood. But there was something about the way he positioned himself, the careful attention he paid to the comings and goings of residents, that triggered Caleb's instincts and made him watch more carefully from behind his kitchen curtains. The stranger appeared again the next evening, and the evening after that, always at a slightly different location but always within sight of Caleb's front door. He carried a newspaper and occasionally checked a pocket watch, maintaining the pretense of waiting for public transportation or killing time before an appointment. But his eyes were always moving, cataloging details, memorizing patterns, building the kind of detailed surveillance picture that suggested professional training and specific intentions. Caleb mentioned the stranger to Sam Fletcher during their weekly lunch at a diner near the fire station, describing the man's appearance and behavior with the precision of someone who had learned to notice potentially dangerous details. Tall, maybe 6 feet, dark hair going gray at the temples, expensive suit but not flashy, carries himself like military or maybe police, never stays in one spot long enough to attract attention from neighbors, but he's definitely watching my house. Sam's expression grew serious as he absorbed this information. How long has this been going on? 3 days that I've noticed, Caleb replied. But he's good enough at what he's doing that he might have been there longer without me spotting him. Any chance he's law enforcement? Maybe federal agents doing follow-up investigation on the Crowley case. Caleb shook his head. Federal agents don't hide when they want to talk to you. They knock on your door and show their badges. This feels different, more personal. Sam was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring his coffee while he considered the implications. Could be a private investigator hired by Crowley's lawyers to gather information for civil litigation. Could be a journalist working on a follow-up story. Could be someone from Crowley's organization looking for revenge or trying to tie up loose ends. Or it could be one of those other family members Crowley mentioned before he died, Caleb added grimly. Someone who thinks Margaret belongs with them instead of with me. The possibility had been lurking in the back of Caleb's mind since that night in the furniture factory, when Barrett Crowley's final words had hinted at a larger network of relatives who might have their own claims on Anna's daughter. If such people existed, they would have had months to organize their approach, to research Caleb's new life and identify his vulnerabilities. What do you want to do about it? Sam asked. I want to know who he is and what he wants, Caleb replied without hesitation. I want to know if he's alone or part of a larger group, and I want to know whether Margaret is in danger. That evening, instead of watching the stranger from the safety of his house, Caleb decided to take a more direct approach. He left Margaret in Evelyn's care, telling her only that he had an errand to run, and positioned himself in an alley that would allow him to observe the stranger without being seen. The man appeared at his usual time, taking up a position near a lamp post that provided good visibility of Caleb's front door. But tonight he was not alone. A second figure lurked in the shadows of a doorway further down the street, also watching the house but from a different angle. The coordination between them was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting a level of planning and resources that ruled out casual curiosity or simple private investigation. Caleb waited until the first man checked his pocket watch and began to move away from his observation post, then fell in behind him at a distance that would allow surveillance without detection. The stranger walked with purpose toward the elevated train station 3 blocks away, but instead of boarding a train, he entered a small restaurant where a third man was waiting at a corner table. Through the restaurant's windows, Caleb could see the 3 men engaged in intense conversation, with frequent gestures toward a map or document spread on the table between them. Their body language suggested familiarity and shared purpose, confirming his suspicion that this was not a random occurrence but part of a coordinated effort. Unable to get close enough to overhear their conversation without risking detection, Caleb retreated to a phone booth across the street and called Sam Fletcher's garage. When his friend answered, Caleb quickly described what he had observed, emphasizing the professional nature of the surveillance and the coordination between multiple operatives. 3 men, working together, watching your house for days, Sam summarized. That's not casual interest or journalistic curiosity. That's the beginning of an operation. What kind of operation? Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The kind that ends with them taking Margaret, Sam replied grimly. The question is whether they plan to do it legally through courts and custody proceedings, or whether they're prepared to use more direct methods. As if summoned by their conversation, one of the men in the restaurant suddenly looked directly at the phone booth where Caleb was standing. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass of the restaurant window, and Caleb saw recognition flash across the stranger's face. The man leaned forward urgently, speaking rapidly to his companions, and all 3 of them began to rise from their table. Caleb abandoned the phone booth and began walking quickly away from the restaurant, but he could hear footsteps behind him, moving at a pace that suggested pursuit rather than coincidence. The hunt that he had thought was over was beginning again, and this time his enemies had learned from Barrett Crowley's mistakes. As he turned the corner onto a darker street that would provide more opportunities for evasion, Caleb caught a glimpse of a 4th figure emerging from a parked car near the restaurant. The man was wearing a long dark coat despite the summer heat, and there was something about his silhouette that made Caleb's blood run cold. The figure was tall and thin, with the kind of predatory grace that suggested violence was a familiar tool rather than a last resort. But it was his face that made Caleb stumble briefly in his stride. The man bore an unmistakable resemblance to Barrett Crowley, with the same sharp features and cold eyes that had marked Anna's brother as a dangerous enemy. Family, Caleb realized with growing dread. Barrett Crowley's family had indeed come to claim Margaret, and they had brought with them the same combination of resources, ruthlessness, and sense of entitlement that had made Anna's brother such a formidable adversary. The war was not over. It had simply moved to a new battlefield, with new players who had learned from their predecessors' failures and were determined not to repeat his mistakes. As Caleb made his way through the dark streets toward home, using every evasion technique he had learned during his firefighting career to shake off his pursuers, he found himself thinking of Anna's final words in her journal. Love is stronger than death. Hope is more powerful than despair. He would need both love and hope in the days to come, because the enemies gathering in the shadows of New York City were patient, professional, and absolutely determined to succeed where Barrett Crowley had failed. Margaret's safety, and perhaps her very life, would depend on whether her father could prove once again that an immigrant firefighter's fierce devotion to his daughter was stronger than money, influence, and the cold calculation of those who saw children as possessions to be claimed rather than souls to be nurtured. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the summer sky, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the city streets like tears from heaven, washing away the dust and heat of the day but bringing no relief from the storm that was gathering around an innocent child who had already lost so much. The story of Caleb Mercer and his daughter Margaret was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.